Okay, the second session today is a comparison really of the Testament issue, the gospel issue. I'm going to make it a little bit broader than that. But the manuscripts of the New Testament, not just the Gospels, versus the Gnostic Gospels from Nag Hammadi. In the Da Vinci Code, one of the characters, Lee Teabing, who is cast in the story as an expert on the Holy Grail, which we find out in the Da Vinci Code, the Holy Grail is not a chalice or cup. It is a bloodline of Jesus. But one of the characters, Professor Teabing, says this: more than 80 Gospels were considered for the New Testament, and yet only a relative few were chosen for inclusion, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John among them. These texts, quote, are the earliest Christian records and the unaltered Gospels. Now, before I turn the slide here, there is a reason why, when the Da Vinci Code came out, every scholar from any theological position, from the most rabid fundamentalist to the most rank atheistic liberal, said, this is bunk. And this is one of the biggest reasons why. These claims, as far as the nature of the Gospels, earliest and unaltered, are just frankly laughable to people who do this for a living. But again, it's like, well, it's just fiction. And everybody could have lived with that if it wasn't for the fact on the first page, or the inside cover of the Da Vinci Code, he talks about the meticulous research that went into this and how this is just going to change everything, and then successive interviews. That's what torqued people off, regardless of their theological position. Because frankly, scholars don't like when people invade their turf and say dumb things about it. Okay? Now, what are the Nag Hammadi documents? You'll notice in red there on the map, the bottom third is Nag Hammadi, the place. The Nag Hammadi texts are a collection of 13 ancient codices, which is essentially what we'll call it a book, something bound on one side or folded, containing over 50 Gnostic texts. They were discovered by accident in Upper Egypt in 1945. The man at the center is the accredited discoverer, Muhammad Ali Saman. Had gone off, kind of like the Dead Sea Scrolls story. He goes off and is looking for fertilizer in the mountains close to his village, and he unearths a jar, and the rest, they say, is history. The books that were found at this location were quickly sold into the black market. The Egyptian government eventually got them fairly quickly. This is what they look like. You'll notice that as manuscripts go, this is pretty decent condition. I mean, you can get a whole lot worse than this. Despite the figure to the left there, you can see how tattered some sections are. They were taken to the Cairo Museum, and another few years went by before scientists knew about them. In 1966, at a conference in Italy devoted to Gnosticism and these new texts, James Robinson assembled a group of editors and translators to publish the codices in English. This is the cover of the book. I have it with me here if you want to look at it today. Robinson was chosen to oversee the project, and eventually a facsimile edition was published. Facsimile editions, they're just literally pictures of each leaf in book form. They're plates. If you've ever seen a book that has plates in it, that's what you get. It's only $750, so rush right out and get yours. It's an expensive set. Subsequently to that, though, there was a translation in English. And the introductory material prefacing the translation, this is taken from Robinson's book, says this: the library of 4th century papyrus manuscripts consists of 12 codices plus 8 leaves, so on and so forth. 4th century. These were Coptic manuscripts. Coptic is just the ancient Egyptian language put into a sort of Greek. A lot of the letters in Coptic and Greek match. There are a few different letters that were added because of the sounds in the Egyptian language that the Greeks didn't use. But there's a lot of overlap there in the language. But these were from the 4th century. Now, the 1st century, I should say this before we go much further, so you get this fixed in your mind. The 1st century is the year 0 to 99. 2nd century begins with the 1, as in 100 on. 3rd century begins with 2. You back it up a digit, okay? So 4th century, we're talking about written in the 300s sometime. This is Coptic, but everyone agrees, and rightly so, that the Coptic texts were actually themselves translations of older Greek material. One of the ways that's known is there are lots of Greek loanwords in the texts. There are other ways to tell that too, but we're not going to worry about that for today. These texts, according to the Da Vinci Code, are the earliest Christian records. Okay. Boy, he didn't look very far for that. Here are some sources, and again, if you get the DVDs, you can look these books up if you're interested, and I recommend taking some interest in textual criticism. I know it sounds horrible, but it's actually really interesting. Text of the Greek New Testament. Textual Criticism by David Allen Black is a nice intro for the layperson. I recommend it. Dave's a nice guy too. He's a friend of mine. Canon of Scripture, F.F. Bruce, is a classic. And the latest work on the canon, The Formation of the Christian Biblical Canon by MacDonald, is really quite good. Again, these are well-recognized mainstream scholars with no particular axe to grind. Let's talk about the date, though. From those books were my sources, places you can go to check up on me as I go through this. If you look at the timeline here, you have the cross, 33 AD. We'll take that as a sort of a consensus date. New Testament Gospels and Acts, the book of Acts, which is the 5th book in the New Testament order, were written sometime between 50 and 80 AD. That is not a conservative fundamentalist number. That is a consensus view. There are very few people who would date them before. Some people would put Mark in the 40s. And there are very few people who would go beyond 80 for any gospel. 50 to 80. Now you have the presumed Greek originals of the Gnostic texts, and you can see with the blue there that we're talking at least 100 years after the New Testament books. And then, of course, the Coptic Gnostic copies. Now, why 50 to 80 AD for the New Testament? What's the evidence? In other words, are you going to come here and just have me tell you that and walk away thinking, oh, that's nice? Why do people say that? Well, there's actually evidence for that. 3 non-technical points for today are the Gospels, all of them, or at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke, prophesy the destruction of the temple. In other words, there's a prediction. Jesus makes predictions about the temple being destroyed. That happened in 70 AD. Everybody on the planet knows that. Okay? However, none of the Gospels mention its fulfillment. So the presumption is that they were written prior to the fulfillment of the prophecy, because nobody mentions it. And that was a big deal in Judaism, a huge deal. Luke never mentions the death of Paul and Peter in either his Gospel or its sequel, the book of Acts. We know from external sources that Paul died in the late 60s, 66, 67 AD. The book of Acts ends before his death, and Luke was written prior to Acts, so there you go. Do the math. Manuscript evidence. This is called the Rylands Papyrus. It is the oldest manuscript in any size of the New Testament. And it dates to roughly the 130s, the 140s, something like that. It is from John 18:31 to 33. This is when Jesus is in front of Pilate. I'm not going to translate the whole thing, but just so you know where it comes from. Therefore, Pilate said to them, "Take him, you all take him, and judge him according to your law." And the Jews said to him, "We are not authorized to put to death anyone." And they said that in order that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which spoke of the type of death that he would die, and so on and so forth. But the red are the letters that show up in this papyrus. And so this is what papyrologists and New Testament paleographical experts do. They'll take a scrap, and now, especially with the use of computers, you can find where the matches are in a document. Okay? This is the oldest one. Now, if this manuscript dates to the 130s, the original, logically, let's put our thinking caps on, logically would have been prior to the 130s. Okay? Again, why doesn't Brown or his sources go into this? They either don't know it, which isn't good if you're writing, especially if you're claiming to write nonfiction, or they don't want you to know, which is probably worse. Do we have any other hard evidence that the New Testament Gospels are older than the oldest Nag Hammadi material? What about the rest of the New Testament? Well, the answer is yeah, we do. Very simply, early church fathers, early church writers quote the New Testament. Like, what else would they quote? They're doing sermons, they're doing commentaries, they're writing theologies. They're quoting the New Testament. And we know when these guys lived because of Roman records. Okay, we know when they lived. We know when Barnabas lived. We know all these figures, their dates, and everything else. So when they quote something, it fixes a date for that quotation. The thing they're quoting must have existed prior to the quotation. This is simple, coherent logic that apparently escapes Brown's sources, or again, they just don't want you to know. The Epistle of Barnabas, there the date 70 to 79, quotes Matthew and Mark. The Didache quotes Matthew extensively, and that's between 70 and 130. Luke and John are both quoted in what's called the Muratorian fragment, again, 170 to 180. There are external methods of dating too, paleographical analysis, carbon-14, whatnot. Polycarp, these are his life dates, 69 to 155, lived a long life. He was a convert of the Apostle John, the John, quotes the book of Acts in his own epistle to the Philippians. The shepherd of Hermas quotes Acts several times. There you have the dates. The epistles of Paul. Romans is cited by Clement of Rome a lot. There are his dates. He's also cited, Romans is cited by Polycarp in the Didache. 1 Corinthians is cited in the Didache and the shepherd of Hermas. So is 2 Corinthians and also by Polycarp. Galatians is cited by Polycarp and Diognetus. Ephesians and Colossians by Polycarp, Clement, and Ignatius. There you have Ignatius's dates. Philippians is cited again by Polycarp. You see a pattern emerging? What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through every book of the New Testament. Every book of the New Testament is quoted in a source earlier than the oldest Gnostic material at all. Every one of them, without exception. Epistles of Paul, more of them, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1 Timothy and Titus, again cited by Clement, the Didache. Ignatius makes allusions to the personal letter of Philemon. There's a debate whether that's an actual quotation or an allusion, but an allusion, works for our purposes. The book of Hebrews is cited frequently by Clement. James also, 1st and 2nd Peter, cited by Clement. 1 John, the shepherd of Hermas. 2 John by Polycarp and other sources. And the book of Revelation, cited by Hermas and Justin Martyr, whose date is 160. Every book in the New Testament is quoted by somebody before any Gnostic gospel was written. I'm not talking the translation, was written. Now, the only possible exception among the Gnostic material is the Gospel of Thomas. Thomas might be roughly contemporary with some of the later Gospels, but that is the only one, and there's debate over that. But I'm telling you because there's debate on it. Okay? And by the way, the Gospel of Thomas, if you, again, a lot of this scholarly material is really expensive, and you have to be near a library to get a hold of it. But there are, you know what a harmony of the Gospels is? When they'll take the Gospels, the four of them, or the three anyway, the three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they will put them together into a flowing narrative. There are sources by scholars, one of whom I know, Craig Evans. If you listened to Coast a couple weeks ago, Craig was on the show talking about the Gospel of Judas. He has produced a harmony of the Gospels and Thomas so that you know where Thomas quotes from the Gospels. Okay? Now, let's put our thinking caps on again. Again, I'm really speaking to people who are going to view the DVD who just are enamored with the Da Vinci Code. If you're quoting from something, that something exists prior to your quote. Okay, it just makes sense. So even in the oldest case, again, it's debated, Thomas might be later, but just so that you know, we're not running from the Gospel of Thomas. The statement implies or assumes several things. Let me go back to the statement. you've seen it before, but repeating it, more than 80 Gospels are considered for the New Testament, yet only a few were chosen. When Teebing says that, you, the reader, are given certain suggestions. Certain things are implanted in your mind. Things like that all the Gospels written in the ancient world were being considered at relatively the same time. There are over 80 Gospels considered, like they're having this big smackdown of Gospels, like we've got to choose which ones are in now. That isn't true. Again, in the Da Vinci Code, Brown's academic characters make the assertion that the decision over what books to include was done at Nicaea. Nicaea did not meet to discuss anything about the canon. We'll get to that when we get to Nicaea, the session on that. But it's not true that all the Gospels were around and they being considered at the same time. He also sort of plants the thought in your head that there existed no early consensus. In other words, roughly around the decades that followed the writing of the New Testament Gospels, for which Gospels told the true story of Jesus, there was a consensus about which Gospels correctly preserve the story. The early church almost immediately recognized what we know as the four. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute or two. But there was an early consensus. What Brown wants you to think is that nobody knew. It was just so up in the air. What do we do? We've got 80 Gospels. How do we know? There was a consensus long before most of the other ones were written. And in fact, Thomas might be the only exception. The four were in existence before any of the other ones were around. That sort of compels a consensus if there's like only four to start with. Third thing is that he creates the impression that all the Gospels were worthy of equal weight or consideration. Nobody believed that in the ancient world. Some liked others. Oh, that one's kind of cool. I kind of like the way that guy says that. And some of them, oh, this is just ridiculous. Why would anyone want to read this? Who's the idiot that wrote it? I mean, it was an uneven thing. It was an uneven thing as far as the other Gospels. The fact is that the followers of Christ had chosen the four canonical Gospels very early, again, with the possible exception of Thomas. Now, here's how we know that. Okay, don't just take my word for it. Here's how we know that. John dies roughly 96 AD. We know the Gospels are 50 to 80. John dies right around 100. In 144, this is 50 years, basically a generation afterward, we have a guy named Marcion come along. Marcion produced some writings in which he divided up the books he thought were inspired or were worthy of canonical status, and he grouped them into two headings, the Gospel and the Apostle. Basically, the Gospel he liked, and then certain writings of the Apostles. Marcion was kind of flaky. A lot of church fathers took off after him, but the important point is that he was thinking of which books were accepted. He did not include the Gospel of Thomas. He did not include any of the Nag Hammadi Gospels. Marcion, to call Marcion orthodox is really iffy, so he could have felt very free to include one of the Gnostic Gospels in his, but he doesn't. Again, you can go look up Marcion and read about him if you want. Justin Martyr, in 160, produces a listing of what he calls the memoirs of the Apostles. In 170, Tatian did something very important. He produced what's called the Diatessaron. It was a harmony of the four. This is 170 AD. Again, this is before most of the Nag Hammadi Gospels are even written. They've never even seen the light of day. Tatian produces a harmony of the four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And it's still available in fragmentary form, mostly in Syriac. The Muratorian fragment, again listed various books as canonical. Again, the Gospels, 170. Describes the four Gospels, 13 epistles of Paul, Jude, and 2 epistles of John, and attributes canonical status to them. Again, this is well before we have Nag Hammadi Gospels floating around. Now, I want to rabbit trail in Tatian's Diatessaron because there's another reason why it's important. 170 AD, he produces this fourfold harmony. This edition proved very popular, especially in Tatian's native Assyria, where the Syriac-speaking church was unwilling to abandon it at the beginning of the 5th century in favor of a new Syriac version of the 4 separate Gospels. Very popular. Now the Gospel of Thomas, again, some people want to date roughly contemporary with the canonical Gospels, but here's the important point. The Gospel of Thomas is called the Gospel to Didymus Judas Thomas. And it shows that title comes from the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Syriac-speaking church. That's the only place that that designation is found, in that part of the world. That tells us that the Gospel of Thomas, whenever it was produced, was around in the Syriac church. And guess what? They did not include it in the Diatessaron. Tatian did not accept it at the level of the 4 Gospels. If he had, we'd have, the Pentatession or something, whatever it is. I'm being a little flippant here. It's not the proper terminology in Greek, but you get the idea. You'd have 5. You'd have a harmony of 5. Or Thomas would replace one of the other ones. Tatian did not deem it canonical. Guess what else? Tatian does not come from the western part of the empire where the evil bishops, the evil Western church fathers could, twist his arm behind his back and say, you better not, you better say the right things about the Gospels. It's also what? 180 years, or 150 years prior to Nicaea. The 4 were accepted hundreds of years before we ever get to Nicaea. If you're going to look at the primary sources, that's the only conclusion you can draw, because that's what they say. At least what we have left. Now, the other claim in the Da Vinci Code, the Gnostic Gospels are the unaltered Gospels. I really love this one. The statement implies or assumes some flawed ideas. One, that the Gnostic Gospels all agree on the details of Jesus' life and his teachings. The Gnostic Gospels don't all agree about who Jesus was and what he said and where he went and what he did. There are disagreements. They do not match perfectly. Therefore, there could have been some changes, some alterations, whatever. They're not this unified monolithic thing that, perfect agreement. It's just not true. It also implies that disagreements between the canonical Gospels invalidate them as accurate sources for the life and teachings of Jesus. Let's examine the logic a little bit before we move on. If I were to, let's just take a look here. Let's go to this one. The Gnostic Gospels do frequently agree or disagree. This is a quote from Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. You will notice here the portion that is in yellow. There are significant differences between the Greek fragments of Thomas, and we must therefore it must have existed in 2 versions, 2 redactions. So on the one hand, the Da Vinci Code wants you to think that the stuff in the New Testament just disagrees all the time about Jesus, and how can any of them be right? There must be errors in there. They don't give us a unified picture of Jesus. Something's wrong here. But over here, the Gnostic Gospels are unaltered. They just present this wonderful story about Jesus, and it's so coherent. And we don't have these problems over with the evil, nasty New Testament where the Gospels disagree with each other on points. It is just buffoonery, okay? On the one hand, the Gnostic Gospels disagree a lot. On the other hand, disagreement doesn't mean error. Illustration. Let's go back to 9/11. Maybe some of you did save the newspaper. If you went to New York the day after 9/11 and you bought 3 or 4 newspapers about what happened on that day, would the accounts all agree word for word? No. You pick up a newspaper any day and look at a common story, sports page, lifestyle, whatever. You have different people writing. They use different words. They highlight different parts of an event. Does that mean that any of them are wrong? Does it of necessity mean that any version is wrong? No. They might be, But it doesn't necessarily mean that, because there's different people. They write from their own perspective. They choose. They have a pile of information in a limited amount of space. Same thing in the ancient world. You don't go down to your Rite Aid or to Office Max and get another ream of paper. You got what you got. And if you screw it up, God be with you to find another piece of paper to write on, because it's not like you can't buy it. You got to make it. And it takes a long time. Or you got to go skin the goat that you're saving, for whatever meal. It's just a different world. On the other hand, let's put yourself in the classroom. Let's say you're a high school teacher, professor, whatever, and you've given an assignment to your class to write a paper. And you go into class the day the paper's due, and you collect the papers, and you're shuffling through them in your office, and lo and behold, there's 4 of them here that they agree word for word. What would you think? Somebody's copying. We have plagiarism here, or somebody's copying, there's collusion, and whatnot. Let's take this to the Gospels. Yeah, the Gospels disagree. Disagreement does not necessarily mean that any of them are wrong. This is why it's kind of neat when people come along and produce harmonies and synoptics. Exact agreement would suggest collusion, but that isn't what you find in the New Testament. I'm glad they disagree, because if they all agreed word for word, that would look like they all got together in a smoke-filled room and said, let's get the story right. That's not what you have. The Gospels disagree again because of difference in audience, difference in personality. There are similarities because these guys know each other. They probably pal around with each other periodically, but there's also independent work. It's just what you'd expect in the normal circumstance of those days. Now, I'm going to recommend some books. Again, check up on me, buy them. They're not expensive, at least these aren't. And these are the best sources for historical reliability of the Gospels from people who are scholars who are aware of the disagreements between the Gospels. Craig Blomberg has produced one on the historical reliability of the Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He has a companion volume on John's Gospel, same focus. This is not light reading, I will warn you, but it's the best thing in print, just bar none. Why 4 Gospels? Again, from my friend David Allen Black. Black tries to write for the lay audience, so if you're going to start somewhere, I'd start with Black, but the mother lode, the trench work, is Blomberg. And Rethinking the Synoptic Problem, again by Black. Okay, that is the end of the session for the New Testament. We have, I can't remember when we started, but we can take some questions again. Summary. I'll try to do this each time. The summary is, you need to match the claims of the book and the sources Brown is using, that the Gnostic Gospels are older, that they're more consistent, that they're more reliable, that they're unaltered. None of those points can stand up with actual historical evidence. Guys who were alive, who were quoting the New Testament, we know their dates are fixed absolutely. They're quoting the material before any of the Gnostic Gospels even existed. Now, I don't know why Brown doesn't put this in his book. Well, maybe I do. It wouldn't sell as well, I guess. But again, he's just a fiction writer. He's Dan Brown, cool idea for a story, let's write one. This is how I make my living. I write neat stories. The people that I think are more worthy of blame, that are really guilty of, frankly, pseudo-scholarship, are his sources. People like Michael Bagent, Lincoln, Richard Lay, Henry Lincoln, Picknett and Prince. These people who are writing, quote, nonfiction, and they're telling you stuff, and they're not giving you the information. They either don't know it, which doesn't speak well of their ability and their credentials for writing this, whatever book they're writing, or they don't want you to know. They have an agenda to push. And either one is bad. I'm going to let them take the pick and explain to you, explain to me why this stuff isn't in their works. Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir.
You went into a long parenthesis on the Gospel of Thomas as the only exception. And I heard the arguments, but I'm not sure exactly it's the exception in what sense of age.
Chronologically, yeah.
And maybe the only one that is as old as the New Testament originals.
Yeah, the reason that is supposed is Thomas is the only Gnostic gospel for which there is Greek material. Remember, the supposition is that you have the Gnostic Gospels, they're all written in Coptic, they are translations of older Greek originals. There isn't one shred of Greek material for any of the Gnostic material except for Thomas. And since we have that from Thomas, and I mean, they're little pieces. It's not like, you don't even have pages, in Thomas's case, but the Greek original is known because of the scraps that are there. And so the difficulty is, well, can we get a reliable date, from the scraps? It's kind of a carbon-14 problem, because to date it you'd have to destroy it, and there's that little of it left. So the guess is somewhere, it might be as early as 50, which would put it contemporary with the canonical Gospels. But that's the only one, just because there just isn't material, for it. Another question.
Yes. Hopefully this isn't redundant, but Thomas preceding the association with Gnosticism, was it, is it considered, as you're referencing, as a Gnostic text? And how was it viewed beforehand? Are there other cases?
Well, have any of you ever read Thomas? Thomas is not actually, you've read it? Okay. Thomas is not actually a gospel like you and I think of a gospel. When we think of a gospel, we think of a narrative history of the life of Jesus. That isn't actually what Thomas is. Thomas is a list of sayings. Think of the book of Proverbs and you have sort of an analogy. They're called logions, or logia would be the correct plural. They're just sayings, things that supposedly Jesus said. So the reason that this collection of sayings is viewed as Gnostic is because some of the content of the sayings, thematically and conceptually, will match Gnostic material that is much longer and more theological, treatises. So that's where the association comes in. And even if Thomas is as early as the 50s or the 60s or whatever, what you have is you have pieces, you have threads of the fuller Gnostic thinking that comes later. You have threads of that, little pieces of it, resident in Thomas, which comes again as we mentioned last time. Gnosticism as a movement is the result of a convergence of threads of ideas. And so you have Thomas reflecting some of those. If all we had, you could go to some Dead Sea Scrolls, and if you just selectively quoted certain lines, and let's say nobody knew where this was from, and you just put it in front of a Gnostic scholar, and he read this line, he'd say, "Oh, that's Gnostic," because it sounds like something that's going to be expounded in Gnosticism later. But so you have these threads out there, these ideas, and that's where Thomas would get the association. Another question?
So now, how did the Essenes fit into this? Like the Cathar Essenes? What period of time were they from?
The Cathars are, of course, in the Middle Ages. And they're going to, just a quick comment on them, the Cathars are going to pick up on certain ideas that are associated with Gnosticism. And so they get linked to Gnosticism, I think somewhat fairly. It's not that you could label them Gnostics totally, but some of the ideas are there. The Cathars, of course, are centuries, frankly millennia later than the Essenes. The Essenes, of course, are living before the New Testament era. The Dead Sea Scrolls will date on the spectrum. Some of the older Dead Sea Scrolls will go back as far as 300 BC. You have some that go into the 1st century AD, as far as paleography and carbon-14 dating. The Essenes are going to be residents at the place Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered. It's still probably the majority view that the Essenes produced what are called the sectarian manuscripts at Qumran, the ones that the community actually produced, as opposed to others they were collecting. Like the Book of Enoch, the Essenes didn't write the Book of Enoch, but they had a library there and it was in there. But some of the Dead Sea Scrolls they produced and wrote about themselves and their own ideas. Those are called the sectarian manuscripts. You will have certain ideas within the sectarian manuscripts, again, little threads that will show up later in Gnosticism. But it would not be accurate to call the Essenes Gnostics because we don't have Gnosticism as a movement when I say movement, I'm talking about a religious system that has its own books and its own fully developed theology. You don't have that until 2nd or 3rd century, and we know that because of the Gnostic Gospels. That's the evidence for that. But you'll have certain ideas that are present at Qumran. A lot of the popular writers like Bagent and Lee and Lincoln and Picknett and Prince want to create some sort of association between the Essenes and the Gnostics and the Masons and all these other groups. The only way you can do that is to ignore the date of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I think there's one person, maybe two that I'm thinking of here. One for sure, there's one scholar who doesn't like the dating, Barbara Tearing, whose writings show up a lot in these other sources. So basically they're quoting Tearing against literally the thousands of other scholars who agree with the work of the team that produced the dating on the scrolls. And Tearing does not base her date on carbon-14 or paleography. She thinks that she's unlocked a coded language in the scrolls that convinces her that there's overlap with the New Testament, and that even though no New Testament characters are mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they aren't, go read them. I'm not keeping you from them. Go read the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're in English. You will not find any New Testament character in any Dead Sea Scroll. Zero. Nada. I don't know any other way to say it. You just won't find them. But that doesn't deter Tearing. She says, well, the New Testament characters are encrypted and they're coded in there. And I'm glad you brought that up, Ted. The best book written on this subject is right here. Written by two liberals. They're not fundamentalists. They're not evangelicals. They're not Bible bangers. Okay, they're two liberal scholars, Jesus, Qumran, and the Vatican. Frankly, they got ticked. They got upset. And, I have often made the comment on radio and in venues like this that it is such a crying shame that scholars think themselves too far above the interested general readership to fool around with this nonsense that people like Bagent, Lee, and Lincoln and these other guys are writing. Honestly, I travel in these circles. Scholars generally are elitists. That shouldn't surprise you, okay? They honestly think that writing against these guys is just frankly beneath them and is a waste of their time. Here's an exception. These two guys finally got irritated enough with this twaddle that they wrote this book. It's probably about 15 years old now. Let me take a quick look. 1994, 12 years. And this is a thorough dismantling of Tearing and all these popular writings. You finally had two guys. They weren't on the Scrolls team, so they're not part of the conspiracy. Okay? They're just two New Testament scholars, early Judaism scholars that just said, enough, enough. This is nuts. And we're going to address it. So they did that. I highly recommend the book. It's out of print. You'd have to get it used, but I found a cheap copy. So you can too. Another question. Okay, let's quit then for a few minutes.